Hey, good morning. As Pastor Barb mentioned, my name is Tom, and I'm on staff in the student ministry area here at Cornerstone, and I just have to name up front, this is the first time I have preached a sermon with wet knees. This is a new experience for me. For those who are watching maybe or listening on the podcast afterwards and didn't catch the beginning of the service, we did baptisms. That is why. So I'm just going to get that distraction out of the way, and now we can go forward with our message for this morning. So I want to ask a question. Who can remember the first time that you realized that you were wildly over your head in the kitchen? Does anybody remember like the first time this happened? Because I know that I do. It was 10 years ago. Kara and I were in our first year of our marriage, and I wanted to knock her socks off with a really special meal for just the two of us. And Guys, I went all out, all right? I was gonna do a full surf and turf dinner. It was gonna be a nice steak. I went to a shop that only sells meat, right? Like I didn't go to the grocery store and I went to a meat shop for the steak. I got the nice shrimp. I found this great marinade I was gonna use. I had the grilled veggies. I had the nice potato dish. I was going all out. I was gonna control every part of this to make this a perfect dinner. And I planned the whole dinner prep part out to the second to make sure that I would be able to do everything and have it all timely and just make this great meal for my lovely wife. And it was all going really well until it was time to take the marinated shrimp out of the bag, and I made the mistake of not double checking that I had a good seal on the Ziploc bag. So I pick this up and turn it over one more time, and half of my shrimp ends up on the kitchen floor with a bunch of the marinade with it, and I freeze. And I'm panicking. And I'm like, what do I do? Because it's not only the shrimp, but it's this great marinade, and I spent so much time mixing all these stuff. I was chopping herbs and doing all this and thinking, well, I need to rinse it off because it has the floor on it. But if I rinse it off, I'm gonna get the marinade off and it's gonna be all ruined. And while I have this conundrum going on, I'm missing my timer for the potatoes. That gets me in all of a tizzy, so I totally forget, one of the vegetables I was gonna put in the veggie medley. And then it came time to do the steaks, and my timing was off and being able to do the perfect flip and the sear, and everything was just totally falling apart. Have you ever been in that spot in the kitchen where it's like, I was way too ambitious with this plan, and I am now way over my head? Anybody else been there? Please, somebody? Thank you. Okay, good. So I look back on this 10 years ago and I remember that moment, but I also remember that it turned out to be a great meal, mostly because Kara came into the kitchen and just bailed me out. And she was the calm, cool head that was like, just rinse the shrimp. There's enough, you're gonna be okay. And we worked on it together. And I actually look back on that meal now, and the best part of it was that we worked on it together, and we were able to spend this time together cooking, and we really enjoyed the meal. So I was thinking it was gonna be this perfect thing that I would do by myself for her, and the joy of it was actually doing it together. It was actually a really important lesson for year one of our marriage right there. But whether you have your own kitchen story like mine or not, just as I wanted to control every detail of the meal to make sure it turned out exactly how I wanted, I think that a lot of us wish that we could control the outcomes of our life a lot more than we're able to, don't we? It could start with something as simple as you wake up in the morning and you're getting ready for something of the day, and you're standing in your closet and you try to figure out the perfect outfit to wear that will not be too much, but don't overdo it, but don't underdo it. And you wanna make sure you make the perfect first impression. So we spend all this time trying to curate it in that, right? Or maybe we planned the perfect family vacation, and we've been looking forward to this for months. We have timed out the flights. We adjusted our itinerary for looking up the weather the week of, and we have everything adjusted, and everything is gonna be perfect and great. And then we get to the airport and our flights are delayed, and so that throws off that schedule. And then we finally get there, and one of the kids just absolutely decides this is the day that they're gonna protest sunscreen entirely, and you decide you wanna fight the battle, but then they get totally sunburned and you wish you would have fought the battle. And so then they're totally sunburned and you have to change your plans, can't really go outside as much. And then as soon as the sunburn is finally better, the weather changes. And then all of a sudden we have to spend our time inside, and this vacation you spent months planning is no longer gonna work out exactly how you'd pictured it. Or maybe you found the perfect job opening or the perfect school that you want to apply for. And so what do? We do everything that we can to prepare for this thing. We go over the application again and again. We rehearse what we're gonna say in the interview. We go over the actual application or the application essay like 12 times. We make sure that we are perfectly ready to go because everything is riding on the outcome of getting this job or getting into the school. And then it's not up to you. And you have to wait to see if you get this like you want it. For the students in the room, there's a play that you really want to go into or a team that you really want to make, and you do everything that you can, and you think, I'm going to control everything to make sure that this can happen, but it's not up to you, is it? As much as you'd like it to be. Or how about this one? We're dealing with a health crisis, whether it's for ourselves or for someone that we love. And all we want is to be able to control this situation. So we read every book, follow all of the advice. We do everything perfectly right. But even then, the outcome is not in our hands. And it's not only frustrating, it's terrifying to realize that control is elusive, especially when it seems to really matter to us. Don't you wish you could control the outcomes of your life? I know that I do. And it's why I relate so much to the character that we are going to look at in the book of Genesis today. So we've been in this series, as you saw on the bumper, more to the story. We're walking through some stories in the book of Genesis, this first book in our Bibles. And guys, there's so many stories. It's a really powerful book, and there's so much that happens. We don't have time to cover it all, but the ones that we've walked in, we've seen this theme emerging, and that's that God is looking for partnership with us, with people. God wants to partner in relationship with us, and yet we keep seeking independence. We keep trying to seek our own way to kind of go about things. And the whole story of Genesis, I might even say the whole story of the Bible, is God trying to restore that partnership with us. So, we're going to look at a new character in the story in the book of Genesis where God is trying to restore this partnership. And that character goes by the name of Abram. It starts in chapter 12 that Abram is introduced to the scene. God says, this is who I'm going to partner with to help restore my relationship with the whole world. So perhaps you're a little bit more familiar with the name Abraham, right? So Abraham, maybe you've heard Abraham more. Just fun fact, later in Abram's story, God actually gives him a new name. He says, you were Abram, you're now gonna be Abraham. A little bit of what's behind that is the name Abram has the root ab in it, which in Hebrew is for father. And then Abraham is kind of this idea of the exalted father, and it corresponds to God making the promise over Abraham's life, you are going to be the father of many nations. I'm going to bless you with so many descendants. So he's now Abraham, the exalted father. How many of us, some of us grew up in church singing the old song, Father Abraham had many sons had father, right? Yeah. So fun fact about this, Abraham's name literally means father. So we're kind of, when we sing that, we're kind of singing, Father man had many sons had father man. That's an interesting, I don't know, I thought that was funny. Anyways, so Abram's story begins in chapter 12, but what we're gonna focus is on chapter 15, because I wanna take a look and have us all explore a moment that I actually think is a true crisis of faith moment for Abram. Because God has called father man to be and tells him, you are gonna be the father of many nations. One problem, he doesn't have any kids. In fact, he and his wife Sarai have been trying for years and they have not been able to conceive. So God has called him to leave his home. He left behind his inheritance and he's out exploring. And we get 3 chapters in and Abram's like, okay. All right, I'm in the tent. We've been doing this a while. God, I have some questions. Can we talk? And so that's where we pick up in 15, where God is saying, how can I know that this is gonna happen, that I'm gonna be the father of many nations? And there's this beautiful moment where God says, step out of the tent, Abram, look at the stars As many stars as you see in the sky, you will have even more descendants than these. It's this beautiful image that God shows as kind of giving him the promise. And then God begins to talk about not only you have these descendants, but I'm going to give you this land that you're going to have and that you and your descendants, your family will have for the future. So that's where we're going to pick up the story in verse 8. Genesis 15, verse 8, Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? How can I know?" So that's a question, I don't know about y'all, but that's a question that I can really relate to. I actually think it's a deeply human and really normal human moment of doubt. Have you ever asked a question like this to God before? How can I know? Maybe the question you asked God sounded something like, well, how can I know that God is really with me when I haven't been seeing God answer my prayers lately? Maybe it sounds like, how can I trust God's promises when life looks so different than what I had expected? How can I believe that God will follow through when I've been let down so many times before? Have you ever asked a question of God of something like that? I think that each of us have moments of doubt in our lives, something like this at some point, when we're faced with uncertainty and we just wish we could know. God, how can I know? And just help me relax a little bit. So how does God respond to Abram's question? We'll pick it up in verse 9. So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." So God says, Abram, go get a bunch of animals. And Abram says, bet. And he goes and gets a bunch of animals. Now, if you're confused on what I said, young people say the word bet as a way of saying that they are very enthusiastic about doing something. Wait, was that not the part you were confused about? Okay, sorry. All the animals, what's going on with all the animals, right? This seems totally random to us. How can I know? Cool, can you get a cow? What's going on here? So while this seems random to us in the year of our Lord 2025, to Abram, a man from the ancient Near East, he knew that God was saying, Abram, let's make a covenant. You want to know for sure that you're going to get this land? We're going to make formal promises to one another in a ceremony that you have seen many, many times before. In these ancient covenants, they were promises between two parties that they would make to one another. And they were often like, one of these covenants would often be marriage covenants, where in a patriarchal society, a groom and the father of a bride would make a partnership and promises to one another in a covenant together. And this would also happen between like tribal leaders, in ancient cultures that were looking to secure peace between the tribes. And how can we be sure that we can make promises that we're going to keep the peace between us? So the way these covenants would work is they would gather up animals and they would cut them in two, and they would take the halves of the animals and arrange them on the side, on the halves on each side. And as the blood was in the center between the animals, the two parties would walk through the path, and it was a way of embodying and saying, if I don't keep up and stay true to the promises I'm making to you, let what has happened to these animals also happen to me. I know it's like a really gory image, right? But if you're gonna make a promise, this gets your attention, right? They were very serious about the promises that they would make toward one another. And this was a custom that would happen often. Abram had seen so many of these. So grab the animals, Abram does that. The other detail that's important in this is that often with the two parties, there'd be a greater party and a lesser party. So in the marriage, it would be the father of the bride that would be the greater party, and the groom-to-be would be the lesser. Or it'd be the more powerful tribal leader and the less powerful. And the custom was that the one who was greater would actually go second. And the one who had less power was the lesser party would go first, kind of as an act of vulnerability, and then the second would come behind. So God says, go gather up a bunch of animals. Abram says, cool, I'll do it. And he begins the work of laying this out. And he must be thinking to himself, great, I asked God, how can I know? God's gonna make promises to me. And he's gonna make promises that you can kill me if this doesn't work out. So that's a pretty good promise. I'm feeling pretty good about that. And then as Abram, this happens in half a verse. But you have to think this took some time. to like gather these animals, to like cut them and to do all of this and arrange this. And so as Abram is engaged in this time-consuming, even like messy, kind of brutal work, I'm imagining if I'm putting myself in his shoes, I'm starting to think about this. The blood's getting everywhere. I've seen these customs, and I'm thinking, oh wait, it's not only God making promises, it's me making promises. I have to make these promises, and I'm going to be telling God that if I don't fulfill these promises, what I'm willing to let happen to me. We kind of get a hint in the text that he's kind of working on this, and the longer that it's going on, he's starting to ask a few more questions internally. We get to the point where everything's laid out and Abram is supposed to go first, and you'd assume, here we go. Abram's going to start, God will follow. This is what happens. Instead, let's look at verse 11. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. All right, there's so much happening in these couple of verses. The first is this chaotic moment that everything's laid out, and all of a sudden the vultures start circling, and then they're coming down, and you get this picture of frantic Abram going, no, get away. Like, you got to protect this. I'm trying to do this formal covenant thing. Like, he's scrambling around. But then here's the thing. Like, vultures don't, like, as soon as something is dead, they're immediately on it, right? They circle. They kind of take their time. A little hidden kind of insinuation in the text is that some time has passed. Why hasn't Abram gone through yet? He's there not long enough that the vultures are swirling and he's having to swat them off. And then the text says that the sun is beginning to set. We're getting to sundown and Abram still hasn't gone through. What's going on? Why hasn't Abram walked through? We get this image of an Abram who is, yes, he's swatting at vultures, but he is frozen in place, standing in front of this covenant that he's supposed to make. I wonder why he's hesitating. Does he have cold feet? Right? He's already left his childhood home and given up his cushy inheritance to follow God. He's already given up so much. But, the other thing about Abram is he came from a family that at the time were worshiping lots of gods. So perhaps he didn't know this God eventually God of Israel, too well yet. And so he's wondering, I'm going to enter into a binding covenant punishable by death if I don't live into it? I wonder if Abram is standing in front of the covenant and he's afraid. Was he wondering if he could really live up to the promises that he was going to make? Could he really trust this God to provide for him? Was he afraid of what this God might do to him? Not if, but if he's honest with himself, when he didn't do this right? Whatever the reason, the passage says that enough time goes by that he falls asleep and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. A thick and dreadful darkness. It's often when we feel alone, when we don't know what's next, when we're waiting on God, but we're not sure if he's really going to come through. This is the moment that fear creeps in. When we feel powerless and vulnerable. When we most wish that we could control what is going to happen, but it's the moment that we're most aware that we can't. Genesis calls it a dreadful darkness. I wonder if you felt this moment before. So I know we're sitting with Abram in this really heavy moment, but I want to pause for a moment to just say something about God. I think God is brilliant. And I know that sounds silly to say, or like, no duh, preacher man, but hang with me. Because even though Abram wasn't sure if he knew God, God knew Abram really well. And one of the things that God knew about Abram is that Abram liked to control the outcomes in his life. We don't have enough time to go into the stories, but Abram and Abraham, even after this moment, there's stories where he tries to take control of the situation, navigate some tricky political times. He's traveling in foreign lands, trying to secure safety. He's lying about who his wife is and all these different things. Abram is someone, you get the sense in the text, he wants to control the outcomes. And I think God knew that. So when Abram comes to God with the question, how will I know? God says, okay, let's make a covenant. And here's the brilliance of God. I don't think it was just that God was speaking a language that Abram could understand. He was doing that. Abram knew covenants. God says, I will speak a language you know. God speaks to us how we can hear him. Something more is happening. I think that God knew that while Abram was doing the laborious, brutal work to set up the covenant, it would finally dawn on him. I can't control this. I wonder if God used this covenant to bring Abram to this exact place so that Abram would finally see who God really was, a crucial part of his character. We're going to skip ahead in the story to verse 17 and the first half of 18. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. This is another, okay, what's happening here? Fire pots and torches and all these things. Well, later in the Old Testament, God presents himself to the people of Israel in two things to show that he was present with them. In the day, it was by a cloud of smoke, and at night, it was with a fire. What was it that passed between the animals in this covenant? First, a smoking fire pot, and then second, a blazing torch. Here's what happened. Abram was hesitating and couldn't bring himself to be the first one to go. And God says, I'll go first. I'm not the lesser party, but I'll go first. And I'll go second. God signs both lines on the covenant agreement. Right? Ancient covenant said, if you fail to keep your end of the promise, you will die. And God goes first in Abram's place. And by doing this, he says to Abram, if you fail to keep your end of the promise, it will be my neck on the line, not yours. When everything was dark and Abram could do nothing, that is the moment where God showed up. And I think that this was the beginning of Abram's journey from doubt. How will I know? To trust. And I think it can be ours as well. Abram learned something about God's character. I think something that sustains him for the whole journey ahead. And I think it can sustain you and me in the moments in our lives where we wish that we had more control. And it is this: God is an initiator. God is an initiator. God initiates. God goes first. God is the beginning and the end of the covenant. God knows that Abram will fall short. God knows that you and I will fall short. He wants to partner with us, and yet he knows us. He knows that we'll try to be independent and we try to control the outcomes and make sure it all happens the way that we want it to. And so God says, I will go first and I will come behind. Out of his mercy, God does not leave us to ourselves and our own devices, waiting for us to finally make the jump. God doesn't just meet us halfway in this thing. God goes all in. God initiates the relationship. So I wasn't given the name that might mean father man. But for a long time, that was something that I definitely desired, to become a dad. And we had made the plans for exactly when we would start our family and how that would fit into our marriage and our adult life and how things would proceed. And the timing didn't exactly play out like that. We started trying, and before we knew it, months had turned to years, and we still weren't pregnant. And I wanted so bad to control this part of my adult life. This has also happened during the pandemic when everything was out of control. I wanted so badly to control this. And if I'm honest, I began to doubt if God was really working in my life. I don't think I ever doubted that God existed, but I did wonder if God was really with me in this time. It was a dreadful darkness. Now, it's a longer story and how the process unfolded. We did eventually get pregnant, and it was this amazing gift, one I had begun to wonder if it really would ever happen for us. And then we found out as twins. And they have been an amazing blessing in our life, but also continuous lessons in accepting a lack of control in my life. But when I look back at this season and how God answered my dreadful darkness, it wasn't just I couldn't control it, but hey, it worked out in the end anyways. There's a lot more to the story. Even in the midst of my dreadful darkness and my feelings of fear and powerlessness and doubt, God was at work the whole time. God was moving even in the struggle, in the waiting, in the very loss of control itself. I didn't become a dad when I wanted, but God was at work at that time, bringing about some things in my life that I never could have brought about that were important to prepare me for the season that was coming. If I had controlled all of this, I would have missed out on some really crucial work that God was doing in me and through me. God didn't just show up at the end. God didn't wait for me to take the first step. God initiated something in me. God went ahead of me. And I think it points out one of the great ironies in this partnership that we have with God. God does his best work in and through us when we aren't trying to control all the outcomes. The brilliance of God in Genesis 15 is that it is exactly when Abram didn't go first in the covenant, when Abram finally stopped trying to control everything, that God makes the promise and establishes his partnership with Abram. Because God is the initiator. Before any one of us became a follower of Jesus, God wasn't sitting around waiting for us to say or do the right things. It was God who was working in our lives to lead us to come to know him. God is the one that takes the first step. That's what we recognized in baptism today. I want to say something to those of you who were baptized. It was an amazing moment, but I just want to remind you, y'all didn't do anything here. You just got dunked. God is the one who drew you to this place. God is the one who worked in your life. God is the one that connects your life to the death and resurrection of Jesus, who invites you into this whole family. God initiates. God does the work. And I think this is really good news for us control people. Well, mostly. Because it might involve a little bit of dreadful darkness. This good news starts out by saying, if you're worried that you can't control the outcomes, well, you can't. You can't control if you get the job or exactly how your career will develop. You can't control if you make the team or if you make the play. You can't control if you'll get pregnant. You can't control the health outcomes for you or for someone that you love. You can't control how long the mental health crisis will last. You can't control whether family members of yours who have walked away from God will return to him. This is the dreadful darkness. But it's right into that darkness that God speaks the good news. That God is an initiator. And this means that this was never about whether you or I would be able to control the circumstances, because God goes before us. And it involves us trusting that God is already at work in every single one of these situations or any others that we have in our mind. That God wants the thriving and flourishing to be in your life and in the world, and he wants us to be partners in this process. God isn't looking for us to solve all of these things. God just wants people who will say yes. and to join him in what he is doing. So Abram eventually becomes Abraham, and father man does indeed become a father of many nations. But it happens through what God initiates in his life, not what Abram does to try to control the situation. A little bit more on that next week. Abraham had faith, and the scriptures say in a few other places that this faith that Abraham had was his righteousness. What I think that means is that through Abraham's life, he learns to trust that God would be the one to bring about the outcomes, and that he didn't need to control everything, that he could simply take the next step in front of him and just trust God. Okay, so all of this boils down to a really simple but really important question. Will you trust Jesus? Will you trust him? I wonder where it is for you that you wish you had more control right now. Perhaps you've lost a job and you're tempted to panic and scramble for control. And trusting Jesus doesn't mean just waiting around for things to happen, but it does mean resisting the urge to grasp at control and security in unhealthy ways, overworking, stressing endlessly, compromising values. What if instead of trying to control all the outcomes, you committed to praying, to taking the faithful steps forward and then resting, even resting while you're in the uncertainty, in the truth that God goes ahead of you and that God will provide. I know there are parents in the room right now who are overwhelmed by the struggles that your kids are facing. And it could be a health concern or school challenges. It could even be the pain that you feel in watching your older kids turn away from the faith that you tried to raise them in. Trusting in Jesus might look like choosing not to try to carry this full burden alone. It might mean bringing these concerns to God in prayer and also remembering and even calling out, God, I need you to be the initiator here and to trust that God is already at work in the lives of your children. For those of you who are parents, that God is the one who will do the work of drawing people back to him. Maybe you're not sure if you've ever made a decision to trust Jesus with your life, and that this is a moment that you want to decide to trust him, to put your trust and your faith in him. Maybe this is a moment for you to rekindle a trust that you tried to get started years and years ago, but this is a moment to say, I'm going to trust in you again. Wherever it is for you, the question is, will you trust Jesus? I hope you will. And not just because I hope there's a bunch more Christians out here, but because of who I believe that God is and who I've come to know God to be, that he is an initiator, that he says, I'll go first, that God says, I will put my own life on the line for you. God shows again and again and again that there are no lengths that he won't go to restore a partnership with you. And so all it takes is for us to say yes. Yes. So if you're willing, I want to invite you to have a moment of prayer with me. And I wonder if we can even embody this. I want to invite you to close your eyes and we'll just invite Holy Spirit to come into this moment and bring to mind for each one of us, is there something that we wish that we had more control over? An outcome that we wish that we could control and make happen? And as we hold that in our minds, I want to invite you to hold in front of you your hands and to squeeze your hands into fists. Squeeze harder, squeeze harder. I want you to squeeze like you are holding on to this thing you wish that you could control. I want you to feel your hands shaking. I want you to feel even the pain in your hands and in your wrists as you hold on to this. Squeeze harder. And then if you hear the invitation from God, I want you to open your hands. And as you feel the rest in your hands, If you feel this prompt, I want you to invite to just pray in a whisper prayer under your breath. God, help me trust you. God, help me to trust you with this. God, you go first. You don't need my perfection. You just need my yes. Help me trust you, even when I want to take control. In Jesus' name, amen.
Hi there. Thanks for watching. Are you looking to learn more about what was discussed today? Check out our Beyond the Weekend podcast, where we dive deeper on things we weren't able to talk about in the sermon. For everything else, visit cornerstonemi.org and have a great week.